Transgender activist Leslie Feinberg proclaimed in a 1992 political pamphlet that the time for transgender liberation had come. Over 20 years later, popular media described the increasing visibility of transgender lifestyles as a trans tipping point, or a trans moment. However, upon further inspection, one discovers luminaries of the Enlightenment already expressed whatever new ideas have come to the fore, and better the first time around. While the number of writings grows beyond count, the new insights fall below the potential characterized by the moment of their conception. Sexual emancipation, conceived of in the Enlightenment era, challenged the natural basis of gender and the nature of sexual identity fixed to procreation within traditional family structures. Marx saw this challenge to the ideas of man and woman had indicated how far man's natural behavior has become human and how far his human essence has become a natural essence for him, how far his human nature has become nature for him. In this way, sexual emancipation was understood within the context of the development of man's transformation of nature, and thereby of himself, of human nature, toward the end of human freedom, the development of all human powers as such, the end in itself, not as measured on a predetermined yardstick. It was this development and elaboration of all human powers as such, of human freedom, which was understood to be the task of world history by those who struggled for socialism over a century ago. It was by their hand that the Industrial Revolution was developed, informing the technical and scientific concepts we use to understand sex and gender, pointing toward their potential overcoming. The political struggles of socialist sexual reformers, such as Magnus Hirschfeld, who founded the Institute for Sexual Research, advocated the legalization of sodomy, prostitution, and cross-dressing, coined the terms homosexual, transvestite, and transsexual in their contemporary uses, and professionalized sex reassignment surgery, stoked the flames of the ongoing process of the Industrial Revolution. Their view that human freedom could be achieved by the simultaneous abolition and fulfillment of the need for production seems almost cavalier on the other side of the 20th century, faced with the failure of the emancipatory project of the world socialist revolution. Indeed, the political efforts of the contemporary movement for transgender liberation appear meager by comparison, and what's more, threaten to liquidate these previous insights. Today, real weakness in the pursuit of freedom is glossed over with the luster of identity. Although we inherit the technological developments bequeathed by the 19th century socialist sexual reformers, today's misunderstanding that the desire to use these technologies is the effect of a congenital pathology or an authentic way of being curtails the freedom of the individual to elaborate his own acquired wants and needs. At the same time, the trans community and its advocates use whatever political strength that they do have to overcompensate for their lack of principle. Left leaders of the LGBTQ movement, either direct employees or indirect advocates of the public services bureaucracy, hold their beneficiaries politically hostage and beholding to the existing dynamics of the Democratic Party. Leftist critics tend to focus narrowly on the influence that private and philanthropic funders have over nonprofit LGBTQ and HIV/AIDS institutions. Budget constraints on these institutions marginalize low-income and transgender beneficiaries, resulting in competition within the LGBTQ community over social services and medical resources. It is true that access to medical and social resources is limited to those who can afford them, and that even after transitioning, access to employment and the rights that come with it is restricted due to discrimination. However, the present left's line of criticism frames the obstacle to sexual emancipation as a betrayal or co-optation of the movement by the Democratic Party, and whatever corporate influences gravitate around it. In this way, trans advocates galvanize support for community institutions which rely on the support of the Democratic Party to offer limited social provisions, such as housing and medical services, to the general LGBTQ community. This elides the deeper problem of the pursuit of freedom in history. Instead, the contemporary left's criticisms reproduce the screen image of patronage to the LGBT community. On the one side, a more smoothly managed and served LGBTQ constituency is envisaged. On the other, a subcultural, aesthetic self-curation thematizes and prematurely sublimates the resentment that one must rely on state-managed bureaucracies in the first place. It is as though every contemporary discussion of trans freedom is expected to fulfill certain requirements, first and foremost, the queer trans identity. The hard left's calls to queer the existing left by means to build a broad movement to pressure the Democratic Party coalesce with the academic navel-gazing inspired by Judith Butler. Both preoccupations provide students with an anesthetic in that they avoid what was once historically possible and obscure their own horizons. Since the principles of sexual emancipation have suffered such heavy losses and have reappeared today in this new form of the trans identity, we have to ask what is still left to it. While a full consideration of this would require a more thorough historical study, what is of concern here is simply that students should become aware of what is absent from today's efforts to bring about sexual emancipation, in particular for transgender people. So the attempt to define the trans identity is weighed down by the same history it seeks to avoid. Attempts to do so are often met with the accusation that one is transphobic, or a trans-exclusionary radical feminist. So for example, Yasmin Nair addressed this on our panel, Women in the Longest Revolution, back in 2015 at Loyola. There she said, the term radical feminism has a very particular meaning in trans discourse and is used to refer to a violently transphobic and trans-exclusionary set of discourses and practices. Julie Bindel is one of the most notorious examples. Capitalism thinks about gender in terms of bodies, and it sees those bodies in terms of embodiments as male and female. That is how it determines the value of embodied lives. And of course, that leaves out non-binary people entirely, whether they're trans or cis. There is an easy and simplistic way to think about trans life within feminism, and that is to bow to the imperative of representational politics, to simply say that the presence of trans people is an excellent thing, period. We are at a great moment in terms of where trans representation is, but not at a great moment in terms of critically thinking through all of that. Even the slightest critical interrogation of what the representation means is considered transphobic. But if we are to think about gender, embodiment, capitalism, and feminism, we have to ask the same question of what trans actually means with a greater degree of honesty than to simply celebrate the presence of trans. To use an analogy, the presence of Hillary Clinton is lauded by mainstream feminists as in and of itself the best possible thing. Everywhere, people are exhorted to vote for her simply because she is a woman, and because it is assumed that we must have a female president no matter what. But as anyone with any serious commitment to left politics can easily tell, Clinton has been an absolute disaster for us. It has by now been acknowledged that she has been a co-president with Bill Clinton, so we do not need to make her responsible for those years of legislation. She has engendered a deeply carceral state, which is to say a state dependent upon punishment, and is responsible for having created a system of welfare reform that has effectively disenfranchised millions of people, mostly poor, both black and white, and has created conditions that will leave them and succeeding generations in dire poverty. Similarly, we have to consider the conditions in which trans identities are made possible and question the extent to which the presence of very beautiful and perfect trans people like Laverne Cox and Janet Mock either enable or disable a critique of capitalism itself. Now, yes, they both do, for instance, question the prison-industrial complex, but what does a trans feminism that takes into account the presence of the prison-industrial complex, the medical-industrial complex, and much more actually look like? And what do we do with trans feminism beyond representation? How do we think about, for instance, Caitlyn Jenner? And what does it mean to be a wealthy trans person who has access to the medical industry complex? How do we relate to that feminism and questions around issues of access to, for instance, abortion, which is a medical procedure which we continually are denied? The left is failing on abortion when it praises Pope Francis. The mainstream feminists have completely failed on abortion. Abortion needs to be accessible to everyone without question, but we've constantly slipped back on that. We're not connecting materialist economic questions around women's access to questions of what trans people have faced and continue to face. So when we talk about trans people having to do sex work, we discuss it in very pathological terms. Isn't that awful that, or trans people are killed because they are targeted for being trans? Well, yes and no, because being trans in the United States also means not having access to a whole lot of things, including housing, having to negotiate existences on the streets, etc. That's what makes you vulnerable to being killed. It's not that they're targeted only because they are trans. The system is making them a target. So trans issues are at one and the same time being made visible and extraordinarily representational, while a whole lot of other very complicated issues around plain economics or material realities are being shut out. Okay, so what is being implied by Yasmin Nair there, that was just like a long quote of Yasmin Nair. What is being implied by Yasmin Nair, that the discontents with the representation of trans individuals is distracting from economic material issues, is actually similar to a point made by Adolf Reed, who compared the left's response to Rachel Dolezal to the left's response to Caitlyn Jenner as an example of the kind of craven opportunism of representational politics around identity. So Reed says, quote, in the context of essentializing political discourse, gender identity must express a condition as natural or inherently equivalent or prior to biological sex. Transgender identity requires being read as, in effect, hardwired only within a normative framework in which access to the domain of recognizable identity, deserving of civic regard, depends on essentialist claims. And the only way transgender identity can meet that standard is to collapse distinctions between sex and gender, even though that move, as Burkett argues, cuts against the grain of the perspective of the women's movement, that the women's movement has fought to advance for at least the last half century. Nor does this view acknowledge the grave political mischief ideologies of essential human difference have underwritten a not all too distant history from segregation and other forms of legal discrimination and the imposition of separate spheres to genocide. The trans-race transgender comparison makes clear the conceptual emptiness of the essentializing discourses and the opportunist politics that undergird identitarian ideologies. There is no coherent, principled defense of the stance that transgender identity is legitimate, but transracial is not, at least not one that would satisfy basic rules of argument. The debate also throws into relief the reality that a notion of social justice that hinges on claims to entitlement based on extra-societal, ascriptive identities is neoliberalism's critical self-consciousness. In insisting on the political priority of such fictive, naturalized populations, identitarianism meshes well with neoliberal naturalization of the structures that reproduce inequality. In that sense, it's not just a pointed coincidence that Dolitzol's critics were appalled with the NAACP for standing behind her work. It may be that one of Rachel Dolitzol's most important contributions to the struggle for social justice may turn out to be catalyzed, not intentionally to be sure, a discussion that may help us move beyond the identitarian dead end. Another way that he's put this is that the politics of identity, such as sex, gender, and race, are not an alternative to class politics, but are themselves a class politics, the politics of the left wing of the neoliberal middle class. So I'm going to draw another comparison here to the view that Yasmin Nair and Adolf Fried have kind of proffered. So Roxanne Baker of the Bolshevik Tendency, formerly the International Bolshevik Tendency in the UK, also made this point on our panel on Marxism and Feminism at our 4th European Conference in London. As she put it, successful bourgeois politicians such as Hillary Clinton, Theresa May, and Angela Merkel have shown how ultimately irrelevant gender is. Under their watch, nothing much changes for ordinary working women unless it gets worse. They talk about women's equality, but their actions serve and protect the status quo. The attempt to build female unity across class lines, as feminists tend to do, amounts to subordinating the interests of poor black and working class women to those of rich ruling class women who derive substantial benefits from the existing social order, regardless of what they may endure as women. The Marxist strategy of uniting all those exploited and oppressed by capitalism is the only way to lay the basis for a world free of social inequality and material want, and thus to realize that possibility that each woman or man pursue their own path and enjoy fulfilling personal lives. End quote. But I want to zoom out for a second. I've been attempting to show how Yasmin Nair, Adolf Fried, and Roxanne Baker have leveled a critique of the trans phenomena on the basis that it distracts from a politics based on the working class. However, this polarization between struggles against oppression on the one hand and struggles against class on the other have been opposed by others on the left. For example, in last month's Platypus Review, Bennett Shoup, in his critique of my article, wrote about a progressive history of the Lgbtq movement since the 1950s, which is based on the overcoming of sexual oppression on the Stalinist model of racial national self-determination. So I actually wanted to quote Bennett Shoup's article at length as well, to tease out what he was talking about, or they were talking about. The Mattachine Society, the first gay liberation organization to achieve some kind of widespread success and notoriety, which was founded on the Marxist principles by former members of the Communist Party of the United States of America in the 1950s. The founder, Harry Hay, was a communist, a teacher of Marxist theory, and the first person to declare that gay people are an oppressed minority. Hay utilized Joseph Stalin's theorization of the nation to declare that gay people constituted not a nation, but a minority within America defined by several of the characteristics that Stalin had outlined as constituting a nation. The CPUSA had similarly expanded Stalin's theory to describe black Americans as a minority group within a nation. Hay simply extended the party's resolution in the Mattachine Society to include gay and lesbian people. While this organization was specifically designed to address the needs of gay people, this was not an example of weakness in the pursuit of freedom glossed over with the luster of identity, or of activists who hold their beneficiaries politically hostage to the existing dynamics of the Democratic Party, as Faze, I charge the modern LGBTQ movement with. This focus on gay identity was a necessity based on the fact that one could not be gay in the CPUSA at the time. In an era full of the persecution of homosexuality as a result of its illegality, gay men and women could not simply ignore their specific oppressions in favor of the ultimate goal of socialism. Furthermore, though their organization did focus specifically on gay liberation, they were committed to an understanding of the co-constitutive nature of all oppression under the causal oppression of capitalism, and sought to place the homosexual liberation movement within the broader socialist struggle. Another example is the Gay Liberation Front, whose work was also dedicated to the larger socialist project. In their statement of purpose of the Los Angeles GLF branch, they state, "We are in total opposition to America's white racism, to poverty, hunger. We oppose the rich getting richer, the poor getting poorer, and are in total opposition to wars of aggression and imperialism, whoever pursues them." And as has been seen in dozens and dozens of cases historically, the white male left, while often not without good intentions, has repeatedly alienated and marginalized people of color, women, LGBTQ people, and others by their sole focus on class struggle and their relegation of anti-racist, anti-sexist, etc. struggles to the margins of socialist organizing. In her collection of interviews with the Combahee River Collective, Kianga Yamata Taylor details that in many of the founding women's stories, their alienation from the white male left was the primary reason they had to form their own organization. The Combahee River Collective is often credited with applying intersectionality intersectionality before the official term was coined by Kimberly Williams Crenshaw in the 1990s. The Combahee River Collective defined their political outlook as struggling against racial, sexual, heterosexual, and class oppression, and seeing as our particular task the development of integrated analysis based upon the fact that the major systems of oppression are interlocking. Okay, so again, zooming out and ending the quote, from this perspective, the trans identity is conceived as either a biological condition that ought to be a protected category in human rights, or as an inherently political way of being. So on the one hand, the contemporary work of biologists and psychologists such as Thomas E. Bevan continues the tradition of socialist sexual reformers such as Magnus Hirschfeld in arguing for trans rights on the basis that transsexualism, transgenderism is a genetic biological condition, or the trans identity, or whatever you want to call it. On the other hand, from the perspective of intersectionality, trans is on the analogy of a racial nationality, a way of being that predates oppression, that when represented or performed disrupts oppression and therefore is also outside of and opposed to oppression. So the first tendency attempts to establish a biological conception of gender and often advocates for reforms on that basis that transgenderism, transsexualism, or the trans identity is a biological condition. This at best takes the form of demands for the changing of identity documents to allow easier access to job opportunities, fair and equal use of public restroom facilities, fair housing, equal military service, fair family law, fair and accessible education, access to healthcare, personal safety, and fair employment. However, by positing the trans identity as a genetic condition rather than as an acquired or developed desire, such reforms merely justify the status quo, in which poor transgender people are heavily dependent on the social services provided by the Democratic Party. The second tendency rebels against the concept of gender, advocating its immediate abolition through performance or disrupting it. This belies the fact that the performativity that is supposed to be enacted requires the very logic of the concept of gender it supposedly rejects. Even those who identify as non-binary define themselves in terms of varying degrees of masculine and feminine traits. Thus, the justification of the political saliency of these lifestyles on the basis of their performativity acts as a substitute for a more critical consideration of sexual emancipation. Moreover, because they are considered to be in and of themselves radical as opposed to prevailing reality, the Popular Front with the Democratic Party in the fight against the right justifies its compromises ahead of time. I recently saw a CNN headline 2 days ago that read, "Biden, the fastest way to end transgender violence is to end the Trump administration." So right, to end transgender violence, just vote for Biden. He'll fight Trump. He'll end it. So meanwhile, Trump has won over a significant proportion of the LGBTQ plus community, not merely the Caitlyn Jenners of the world, but to his own platform, and has dragged the constituents of the Reagan coalition into the era beyond the neoliberal business management tactics of celebrating diversity, as he literally waves the rainbow flag in celebration of the LGBTQ community as an expression of American freedom at his rallies. Nevertheless, Bennett Shoup tried to guilt me into submission by raising a quote from Lenin's left-wing Communism and Infantile Disorder, in which Lenin says, "The Bolsheviks could not have preserved, let alone strengthened and developed and reinforced, the sound core of the Revolutionary Party of the Proletariat in 1908 to 1914 had they not strenuously fought for the viewpoint that it is obligatory to combine legal and illegal forms of struggle, that it is obligatory to participate even in the most reactionary parliament." As if the DSA and the Marxist Center were the sound core of a mass revolutionary party of the proletariat, capable of leading the revolution, and are not simply tailing the Democrats, who in turn are tailing Trump. So the attempt to conceptualize the trans identity as a biological condition leads theorists to take for granted that trans people are actually dependent on this existing state and these dynamics that I was just illustrating. While those who attempt to disrupt gender through performance take for granted their own shared assumptions with the social scientists and biologists and fail to offer any critical insight regarding the historical advancement of sexual emancipation beyond the conservative goal of state management of superfluous populations. In this way, both tendencies overlook how the desire to transition is acquired towards the end of elaborating one's own creative, sexual, emotional, and erotic needs. Instead, through the trans identity, sex is treated as a congenital pathology or a way of being. One could be assigned the wrong sex, so to speak. These tensions within and specific to the trans identity can be better understood as an evasion of a historic failure in our present, namely the failure to advance the project of human freedom in history. This absence may be brought into relief by considering how sexual emancipation appeared throughout the development of capitalism and simultaneously the development of the struggle for socialism. Hold on, let me just take some water for a second. The orthodox Marxist view would have been to understand how the emancipatory concept of gender that emerged in and through the bourgeois revolutions had in capitalism become self-contradictory and self-disintegrating, and therefore pointing beyond itself towards socialism. And this actually came up during the Marxism and Feminism panel that we had in London that I referred to earlier. So in response to Roxanne's arguments against the politics based on identity and the success of the female politicians and the neoliberal middle class, such as Theresa May, Nicola Sturgeon, and Angela Merkel, one of the students in the audience asked, since gender is irrelevant, do you think that gender is collapsing? And how do trans people fit into this discussion of how gender is collapsing in capitalism? To which Judith Shapiro, who is a teacher at the London School of Economics, where I got my master's from, and who's a former member of the Spartacist League, responded. She was a former member of the Spartacist League, but she also quit and started working for the Russian Federation as an economist. But so she's had like a crazy political career. But she responded saying, "What fascinates me about this is that the gap between men and women is closing, and that tells us something about whether it's nature or nurture. So I think that we're not going to know, but it's been happening before our eyes as well. I do know that women will bear the children. That is going to be a fact. It's sort of a bottom line as far as I know, but not necessarily. Maybe men will. Actually, no, I take that back. I read about it. We're going to have clones, right? And babies will be delivered by flying cars, right? I don't know how far that will go, actually." And so, she kind of provocatively put this, the family and these gender relations, these kinship relations that we have in capitalism, they're disintegrating, and our imagination for how they could be different is actually self-contradictory. This is significant because it's reflective of this orthodox Marxist approach to the question of sexual freedom, as opposed to a vulgar Marxist idea of competing interest groups, whether that's between the wealthy and the poor, or between labor and LGBTQ constituencies of the Democratic Party machine. Rather, Shapiro was highlighting how gender as a social relation and how we imagine it ought to be is actually conflicted and self-contradictory. On the one hand, why shouldn't men who want to experience childbirth be able to undergo sexual transition, and in doing so take on the task of child rearing? On the other hand, why shouldn't we have cooperative industrialized birth on the scale of the fictional future societies in Brave New World and The Handmaid's Tale? Our imagination of how these social relations ought to be is actually self-contradictory and points beyond itself. This older Orthodox Marxist interpretation was recognized and elaborated in an article in the Platypus Review by Benny Adamczuk. There, Benny wrote that sexual and gender emancipation, as conceived in socialist theory by Engels, Bebel, Zetkin, and Kallentai, was proposed in the context of a critique of the family, which was regarded as in the process of being overcome. This theory regards the pre- and petty bourgeois family as a unit of production that provides the means of reproduction for its members. while dividing the labor necessary for this task along gendered lines. Once the capitalist industry is able to supply cheaper textiles, foodstuffs, and tools, the family loses the key productive functions. Thus, the family plunges into crisis, and with female labor, this crisis is at the same time a crisis of the patriarchal hierarchical division of labor. Socialism, in classical teleological manner, has the task of bringing the tendency that had been nascent under capitalism, namely the withering away of the family and of institutionalized sexism, to its logical conclusion through a process of socialization. In other words, the remaining functions of the family would be socialized, or, what is unfortunately more likely, nationalized. When children are raised and educated by large democratic and anti-authoritarian institutions, when food is distributed in public canteens rather than small kitchens, when the elderly and the sick are no longer cared for by so-called relatives, and when the cleaning of apartments is no longer privately organized, then the family has become superfluous and withers away. Consequently, the gender division of labor would be superseded as well, which, after all, is the foundation of gender differences and the sexist exploitation of unpaid reproductive labor. Unlike Western feminism, which strives for changes within the family, socialist feminism directly proclaims the family's abolition. Our task does not consist of striving for justice in the division of labor between the sexes. Our task is to free men and women from petty household labor. So, end quote. However, Adamczuk went on to reject this orthodox view on the basis that, quote, the gender movement of the 1917 revolution was universal. It is the movement of a universal masculinization. All humans become men. The Bolshevik movement declared wealth to be the precondition for freedom. At the same time, it restricted the wealth of social possibilities. It discarded those subjectivities that had emerged in the sphere of reproduction and declared that relations that created those subjectivities to be backward. Thus, femininities that arose historically were no longer proved to be the resources of the revolution. Such an artificially scarce foundation also complicates raising the communist question, namely, how the totality of necessary labor should be organized so that we're able to satisfy those needs that we think are worth being satisfied. All genders and all social relations that produce them would have to be understood as social wealth, as effective, habitual, intellectual, and practical resources that a communist society could choose from during the process of its liberation. That, in short, is the element of freedom that the Russian Revolution had stopped short of by about halfway. End quote. The publication of that article was the initial motivation for my article on transgender liberation. Adamczuk is correct that the failure of the world revolution fell below its own goals of replacing the disintegrating familial, sexual, romantic, erotic, and gender relations with new ones. However, I disagree with her assessment that the Marxist project was doomed from the start. The crisis of social relations in civil society that the trans identity touches upon, of the family, of gender, of sexuality, etc., indicate the continued need for such a project that aims to lead the transformation of these relations beyond their current disintegration. The circumstance in which the advancement of the technical forces of production make it possible to imagine the global dispensation from material labor, which requires the reproduction of these social relations in the first place, indicates the possibility for everyone to be free from labor and thereby to freely take part in the transformation of an actually free society. However, in the absence of any project in the present, it is any such project in the present, it is difficult to imagine that anything could have been otherwise. The International Political Party for Socialism provided the context for actual antinomies in the struggle for sexual emancipation itself, for instance, like those that Judith Shapiro pointed to. It allowed for those to become consciously manifested in anticipating the next step. Without this context, however, it is entirely unclear which way forward for sexual emancipation. In its stead, there is a vacillation between capitalist anarchy on the one hand and state-administered capitalism on the other. So I was primarily concerned with holding up this historic example of Marxism in order to illustrate what is absent today. I guess, since it's been about 40 minutes, I could stop there. I could continue to read the rest of the article. I guess it's up to you guys. If you've all read the article, I don't have to continue reading it, but...
I think you could keep going. I think it was interesting. I had a question about something specific from the article, which you might actually get to. But that could be a way to transition.
We could transition.
Unless you guys have any specific questions, because I'd say start with those first. Anyone else have some? I mean, I was you mentioned Hirschfeld practically using the terms like transvestite, transsexual, and homosexual in response to certain legal stipulations. And I was wondering if you could expand on how that sense of practical politics is
probably a contrast with the current use of sort of naming and things like, because again, you were sort of accused of transphobia for using a word like transvestite. It's like, so
right.
Can you sort of explain like why the term transvestite and then what actually the usage was in the contemporary sense?
Sure. So yeah, I think this relates to another point that I was unsure of how to like bring in response to Shoup's article, which, so on one hand, I was accused of being transphobic and homophobic for using words like transvestite and transsexual, which are apparently passé, depending on who you ask. But also I was using them in historical context, so even that accusation is kind of strange. But on the other hand, I was accused of not recognizing like the role of reforms in building a revolutionary party,
right.
Which is absurd because like half of my article was addressing like the sexual emancipation movement's reforms and talking about these psychological categories that people are now using as like natural identities actually came out of those reforms. So yeah, I guess I guess I could kind of jump to that part in the article, or maybe I could keep reading because I think like that's where it's going. Because the next section in the article is like I'm talking about the difference between like these kind of like prehistoric or like early historic like gendered castes and then like what happened in like the bourgeois revolution. So I might by way of your question, like jump back into the article. But so the effort to consider what is absent in today's movement for transgender liberation in relation to the history of the left must be carefully distinguished from a nearly universally accepted understanding of what is called transgender history, namely, the idea that trans people have always existed since the beginning of humanity and will always exist. This view, however, was first proffered by sexual reformers working within the homosexual emancipation movement in order to argue for the natural basis of legal rights. The socialist sexual reformer Magnus Hirschfeld, for instance, claimed that sexual minorities deserved rights on the basis that their condition was biological, in part evidenced by the fact that people had lived this way since the beginning of human history. This argument was used to justify sexual reforms, such as the Scientific Humanitarian Committee's famous and unsuccessful attempt to repeal paragraph 175, the law which penalized sodomy in the Prussian Empire, as well as the distribution of identity documents for transvestites by the Berlin municipal government in 1908. This natural explanation has prevailed, however, uncritically, and can be recognized in Leslie Feinberg's 1992 pamphlet, Transgender Liberation, Movement Whose Time Has Come, wherein she claimed that transgenderism predates oppression. For Feinberg, transgenderism, due to its superficial resemblance to certain castes and matriarchal communalist societies of the Paleolithic era, is venerated as outside of and even a priori against capitalism. However, these pre-modern cross-gendered castes were specified as roles within closed spiritual cosmologies and traditional family structures. So let us recall that in Okinawa, the process of wanagunati was used by male shamans to become female, or that in South Asia, the Hijra undergo a similar process in order to participate in the rituals of their community. We also can recall the mujeres, third sex, still found in Oaxaca today, who live with their mothers for their entire lives in order to perform those productive tasks which seem best suited to them, namely domestic labor. Or we can consider the historic role of the two-spirit genders in the Pacific Northwest, whereby women could become woman-men as hunters and men could become men-woman by performing domestic labor. Each of these examples illustrates a gendered caste, which is determined on a role within the family or spiritual community. What is recognized as a similarity between the ancient and modern world betrays a sense of our own historical moment, the simultaneous movement beyond the family and its latent persistence. What Marx wrote of the bourgeois myths of the ancient world describes this well. This is why the childish world of antiquity appears on the one side as loftier. On the other side, it really is loftier in all matters where closed shapes, forms, and given limits are sought for. It is satisfaction from a limited standpoint, while the modern gives no satisfaction, or where it appears satisfied with itself is vulgar. Hirschfeld, by contrast with contemporary activists such as Feinberg, was consciously taking up a project he had inherited from the bourgeois revolutions. The rise of emancipated free labor challenged the natural basis of gender and the nature of sexual identity fixed to procreation within the traditional family structures, giving rise to new social forms of sexuality and sexual identity. Emancipated laborers were not only free to determine what sorts of work they could take up, but also what sorts of lives they would lead. Laboring individuals could work for a period of time so as to elaborate their own creative capacities, needs, and interests in their free time through exchange. What is of concern to our argument our present argument, is the development of the laborer's own personal, sexual, erotic, emotional, and familial desires and needs. We can recall the emergence of the Molly houses, effeminate male brothels in the 18th century. Dr. James Barry, a male surgeon in the British Army, who was discovered only after his death to be a biological female. The life of Chevalier d'Eon in the 18th century, who lived his first 49 years as a man and her last 33 years as a woman, among many other examples. Whereas the pre-modern caste were intended to give a closed form of life in order to reproduce a culture as it existed, the freedom of sexuality in modern society is open-ended. Modern individuals are tasked with making meaning of their own lives in relationship to the development of freedom in society, that is, in terms of history. The cultural developments within society that facilitated sexual emancipation concomitantly gave rise to political transformations. Most significantly, in 1791, the French National Assembly repealed punishments for sodomy and cross-dressing. This new legal system was subsequently spread across Europe in the form of the Napoleonic Code. The German states of Bavaria, Württemberg, Baden, Hanover, and Brunswick had all taken up their own versions of this code, abolishing the penalization of same-sex sexual behaviors and cross-dressing, while the less liberal states such as Saxony and Prussia had retained the feudal laws. It was against this background that socialists took up the political demand for sexual emancipation as part and parcel of the social question in the 1848 revolutions. Just as most socialists agreed on the goal of abolishing the state, they also agreed on the goal of abolishing the traditional family and a division between the sexes. The failure of the democratic revolutions of 1848 and Bismarck's subsequent efforts to establish Prussian hegemony, culminating in the foundation of the German Reich, gave way to the reintroduction of the Prussian sodomy law for many states in Germany in the form of paragraph 175, and the laws criminalizing cross-dressing as a public nuisance in the form of paragraph 360(11) and 183. Consequently, people who were formerly free came to recognize a significant loss in their freedom. An aspect of their life suddenly became a crime. In response to these circumstances, intellectuals such as Karl Ulrichs had developed the term urning, a reference to Plato's Aphrodite Urania, to describe a biological condition in which a person with a feminine brain lives within a masculine body, and to write publicly in defense of those who were punished for it. Ulrich's works inspired literary personalities such as Oscar Wilde, Edward Carpenter, and James Addington Symonds to further popularize this term. This urged, in turn, sexologists such as Richard von Krafft-Ebing and Karl Wetzfeld to research sexual inversion and the contrary sexual instinct, which simultaneously facilitated their readers using these terms to identify themselves and their own obstacles. In order to maintain their jobs and their livelihoods, they used these newly developed terms as focal points around which to form civil society organizations to coordinate the development of social clubs, litigation, and minor municipal reforms, only insofar as existing municipal procedures had become obstacles to their livelihoods and organizing. Because liberals had abandoned the desiderata of sexual emancipation and the separation of the state from private life due to pressures from the right, only socialists such as Hirschfeld remained. Hirschfeld founded civic institutions to facilitate the further development of the sexual emancipation movement and the struggle for social reforms. These institutions included the Scientific Humanitarian Committee in 1896, the Institute for Sexual Research in 1919, and the World League for Sexual Reform in 1928. Through his work in these institutions, Hirschfeld would come to define the terms homosexual, transvestite, and transsexual, and distinguish them from one another in the way we understand them today. However, rather than understanding these terms as innate identities, Hirschfeld understood them in relation to the types of political obstacles faced by his patients. So paragraph 175 corresponded to the definition of homosexual as one who finds a love object of the same sex, because this law criminalized same-sex sexual activities. Paragraphs 360(11) and 183 corresponded to the definitions of transvestite and transsexual as someone who felt and behaved as the opposite sex, because these laws penalized public cross-dressing. The lack of state-regulated medical resources corresponded to the further specified term transsexual, which was used to describe those who would use unregulated medical procedures and surgeries on themselves in order to appear as the opposite sex. Hirschfeld's institutions worked to clear these political obstacles. The Scientific Humanitarian Committee put forward political petitions to the Reichstag in 1898, 1922, and 1925 to repeal paragraph 175. When Hirschfeld's Scientific Humanitarian Committee first put forward their 1898 petition to repeal paragraph 175, leading Orthodox Marxists such as Karl Kautsky and August Bebel supported it, Kautsky argued in his series of articles critiquing state socialism that abolishing the state would facilitate the development of a free society with new forms of communal life and kinship. It was this understanding of sexual emancipation in relationship to the need to conquer state power in order to bring about a social revolution that led Kautsky to support the petition. Similarly, August Bebel, co-founder of the SPD, gave a speech in the Reichstag in favor of repealing the penalization of sodomy, arguing primarily against the state's intervention into private life. Orthodox Marxists such as Kautsky and Bebel could take up this emerging discontent on the basis that it expressed the problem of the state rising over society, pointing to the need for a political revolution in order to fulfill and overcome the possibilities for freedom that arose in the bourgeois revolutions and were being expressed in an unfree way in capitalism. So, sexual reforms in the political revolution. While the effort to repeal paragraph 175 was highly politically articulated, the efforts to mitigate or repeal paragraphs 360 and 360.11 and 183 were only pursued insofar as they presented an obstacle at the local municipal level. Hirschfeld and his colleagues, such as psychoanalyst Carl Abraham, attempted to change the prosecution of paragraphs 360.11 and 183 at the municipal rather than the national level. By 1905, Hirschfeld and Abraham had convinced the Berlin municipal government and its police to issue their transvestite patients certificates and passports if they could show that they had approved medical documentation. These transvestite certificates showed that the police knew the bearer's behavior and so was not guilty of creating a nuisance. These and other developments of the socialist movement raise questions about the relationship between the socialist struggle for reforms and the task of seizing state power in relationship to a political revolution. Lenin, for instance, in his 1902 pamphlet, What is to be Done?, agreed with the orthodox Marxists such as Kautsky that social democracy must saturate the working class with a consciousness of its position and task. Lenin saw the party could mediate the water efforts of the socialist movement, allowing the movement to reflect on its own activity in relation to its end goal. Thus, political education would comprise, quote, illuminating all aspects of life and be conducted among the broadest possible strata of the masses, to the extent that capitalism, quote, manifests itself in the most varied spheres of life and activity, vocational, civic, personal, family, religious, scientific, etc., unquote. Similarly, in her 1900 pamphlet, Reform and Revolution, Luxemburg argued that the advances in capitalism, which resulted from the growth and success of the socialist movement, such as the development of credit, the employers' associations, communication services, and the political strength of the trade unions, aggravated rather than attenuated the conflict of capitalism, creating the potential for new crises and deepening the need for revolution. Thus, she argued that the party must mediate between the practical accomplishments of the movement and its consciousness of the necessity, possibility, and desirability of the end goal. In Lenin's and Luxemburg's terms, the party facilitated the development of this socialist or class consciousness. The ostensible advances of the socialist sexual reformers can be understood in the same way, as an aggravation of the crisis of society and capitalism, posing and deepening the necessity, possibility, and desirability of the revolution. The supposed successes of the sexual reformers posed the necessity for a critical reflection on the relationship between the movement for sexual reforms within the broader socialist movement and the end goal of socialism. The mass socialist parties of the Second International were a necessary precondition for even considering this question practically, because the International actualized the possibility of taking state power to the end of a world socialist revolution in the first place. To the extent that the party was regarded as the focal point of coordinating the efforts for sexual reforms, reformers such as Hirschfeld and orthodox Marxists such as Lenin, Luxemburg, and Kautsky, as well as Bebel, were in practical agreement. It was only after the Russian Revolution of 1905 and the subsequent political successes of the SPD and the Reichstag that the differences between reformers, orthodox Marxists, and the radical Marxists kind of manifested itself. The emergence of workers' councils as a bourgeois democratic form with de facto power in the 1905 revolution posed the practical possibility of party-educated workers taking state power to lead the revolution. The party leadership's support for parliamentary reforms, which were opposed to proletarian socialist leadership of the revolution, anticipated the SPD's later support of the provisional government in the October Revolution of 1917 and the failed German Revolution of 1918. As the largest party in the Reichstag, the SPD itself had begun to lead society, and consequently took on the same crisis of society. In the context of socialist sexual reforms, this meant that the advances of the party's efforts to ameliorate the conditions of, quote, sexual variance, unquote, was also simultaneously deepened with the problem of the capitalist state. In November of 1918, Hirschfeld wrote that with the establishment of the provisional government by Scheidemann and Ebert, all of those whom the sexual emancipation movement had fought for would finally be liberated from their oppression. With the removal of the Prussian state and the relaxing of obscenity laws in 1919, Hirschfeld could broaden his work under the new state management of the SPD by developing his Institute for Sexual Research and the World League for Sexual Reform. In 1919, after Ebert and Scheidemann had put down the Spartacist uprising, the state of the Weimar Republic required the police to delegate some of their authority to new positions within the state bureaucracy, social workers. Hirschfeld relied on this expansion of the state bureaucracy and its social workers to process legal name changes for his patients. The same year, Hirschfeld founded the Institute for Sexual Research in order to provide regulated medical services to his patients. Prior to this, his patients would perform a variety of surgical procedures on themselves, including hormone replacement therapy, self-castration, facial hair epilation, paraffin injections, breast removal, and uterus removal. And when I say that they would perform these themselves, I mean they would seek this themselves they wouldn't go through the state, they would do it kind of under the ground. By 1921, the Institute had attempted its first male-to-female surgery. By 1922, the Berlin municipal government changed their enforcement of the penal paragraphs 360-11 and 183, reiterating that wearing clothes of the opposite sex was not illegal unless it involved prostitution. Just as Scheidemann and Ebert rendered the workers' councils impotent by incorporating them into the state through the Workmen's Council's legislation in order to preserve the Reich state under new management, Hirschfeld relegated the sexual and gender identities of sexual variants to the realm of state management. So I'm making a comparison between how labor, in the wake of the failure of the revolution, became an object of state management. So too did the sexual emancipation movement simply just become an object of state management. By contrast, in the October Revolution, when the Soviets conquered power from the provisional government, they abrogated the Tsarist legal codes, thereby abolishing the penalization of sodomy and cross-dressing. This opened up the potential for various lifestyles to develop in private, just as they had in the 17th and 18th centuries, without the guardianship of the state. Because there were no official state positions concerning issues of homosexuality, transvestitism, or transsexualism, medical and juridical experts would weigh in with their professional opinions if and when political problems concerning sexuality and gender emerged at the level of the Soviets. Medical doctors and psychologists such as N.F. Orlov and P.B. Kunishkin were influenced by Hirschfeld's efforts, insisting that the Soviets should not disregard requests for sex change as a decadent German problem. Indeed, the medical entry on homosexuality in the Great Soviet Encyclopedia, written by the psychologist Mark Seresky, was inspired by Hirschfeld's research. Seresky assumed Hirschfeld's belief that sexual variation was a natural condition, which should not be penalized. Throughout the 1920s in the European regions and urban centers of Russia, it had become regular, though tenuous, for individuals to request and for Soviets to permit an operative and lawful sex change. In Moscow's city health department, some medical practitioners would carry out the surgery, and several medical cases show that doctors documented their patients with both a female and a male, or male and a female name. Presumably, these patients and their doctors took advantage of a legal loophole which allowed patients with hermaphroditism to undergo surgery. Some of these individuals even gained legal family rights. When a female-to-male transsexual, Evgeny Fedorovich, married a female postal worker in 1922, a Soviet court decreed that the marriage was legal. However, due to the infrequency of these cases, the 1929 Expert Medical Council postponed clarifying, quote, the right of transvestites to enter into marriage with persons of the same sex, and the right of doctors to produce operations to change the sex of transvestites, legality for another time. Despite the advancements in sexual freedom achieved by the October Revolution, the resources of the Soviet state did not match the goals of the Communist Party, not least of all with respect to the issues of sexuality in the family. And this is the extent to which I would agree with someone like Binia Adamczak that that there was a failure on the part, there was a failure of this world historic movement of Marxism. The failure of the revolution to become international and the turmoil of the Russian Civil War engendered ideological disorientation resulting in the subsequent period of Stalinization. For Trotsky, the suppression of the youth's questions about the compromise of the party's stated goals as a measure to prevent splits and factions naturalized the unfavorable conditions of the Civil War and curtailed the party's ability to anticipate new possibilities and tasks. Trotsky argued that the convolution of the party and the state bureaucracy motivated the repression of questions with regard to the party's utopian goals. This conflation led to the reconstitution of traditional moral and family laws, which would more exploitatively enforce the reproduction of the working class, including the reinstatement of the law criminalizing homosexual behavior. This abandonment of the party's role of anticipating the tasks towards the proletariat's this abandoned the party's role of anticipating the tasks towards the proletariat's own self-abolition. The reversals of sexual liberation during this period of reaction, such as the banning of sex reassignment surgeries and the recriminalization of homosexuality, could be understood as part of the problem of the failure of the Socialist International and its leading parties, the SPD and the RSDLP Communist Party, to realize their end goal. Just as the theory of vocal Marxists throughout the crisis of Marxism naturalized the relationship of the movement and the party to the state, resulting in ideological obstacles to the task of advancing the socialist revolution, the theory of the socialist sexual reformers naturalized the relationship of sexuality to the state, resulting in ideological obstacles to critical reflection on the failure of the revolution. Both Hirschfeld and Sureski prioritized the biological as opposed to the social explanation of sexuality. Not only did this obscure the way in which sexual variance is a manifestation of an individual's free pursuit of happiness, but moreover, this same biological understanding was the basis for the recriminalization of homosexuality in both Germany and Russia. This cast the supposed advancements of the 20th century, such as the gender clinics of Hirschfeld's student Harry Benjamin, in a different light. It would allow us to understand them as moments in the self-liquidation of the party throughout the 20th century, which permit us to apologize for declining political horizons today. Benjamin used Hirschfeld's terms Benjamin used Hirschfeld's terms to relegate transitional hormones and surgeries to those who had exhibited the correct pathologies. Competition for these resources reinforced fractures within the gay subculture between transvestites, transgender people, and transsexuals. Subsequently, the term trans itself was proffered by Geordie Jones as an umbrella term for all gender variants. But still, the social pressures on trans individuals to come out as an authentic self that one always was has reinforced the ways in which trans people have been integrated into the state-regulated medical industry and the LGBTQ public services bureaucracy. The extent to which sexual emancipation remains a salient political demand is the extent to which it has continued to develop as an aspect of bourgeois society, however in crisis. There can be no sexual freedom in an unfree society. Actual sexual emancipation is not realizable on a basis of generalized want in response to the crisis of capitalism. This would have to be replaced by the unfeathered development of human potential as Marx formulated nearly 160 years ago. Socialism, should it become a world historic effort building upon this newly emerging political context, could not offer anything particular to any group or any particular creed. It could only offer the emancipation of all humanity. Without a mass international socialist party, such as the Second International, there is no room for critical reflection or debate actually informing mass political practice and international social action. Without this, it is not possible to critically recognize sexual liberation's own history in relation to emerging practical tasks and possibilities for social change. The struggle for socialism and sexual emancipation can be understood as epiphenomena of the historical problem of advancing the project of freedom, rather than as interest groups within the state, as they were seen in the past by Hirschfeld and as they are still seen today. The contemporary left attempts to use them to mobilize constituents as pressure groups to agitate existing civic institutions and the Democratic Party. However, their more powerful effect is the political miseducation of the youth that they aim to enlist to such a cause. Not only do today's ostensible advances run the risk of transforming into their opposite, but even worse, the potential to even consider, let alone make use of history, is constrained. The left today, in their resistance to the state and gender, actually identify with both. The disjecta membra of previous attempts to change the world are used to justify the wrongness of the present one, whereas the point in the past was to master society as a kind of second nature and thereby pose the possibility of transforming it. So to bounce back to Tomas's question about these kinds of different psychological categories being developed in response to political obstacles. It's basically presumably after the state is transformed in the revolution, those categories would also have to be transformed and overcome. And actually, people would be free of them. Even though they're expressing and they're byproducts of people's struggle, and they express the kind of necessary opportunism, because if you can't just think it on your own, you have to try and actualize the possibility for it. so like yeah, there's this kind of necessary concession to opportunism, unfortunately, but it actually it's an expression of the deepening of this problem and the deepening of the crisis by actually realizing the possibility of sexual emancipation, like you're reproducing the problem on a higher level, and so right, like those categories, that system would have to also be overcome eventually.
Could you say a bit more? What do you mean when you say that the gender arose with the bourgeois revolution?
Right.
Because most people tend to naturalize these things today. So.
Right. Yeah. Well.
Do you mean gender identity? Like.
Right. I guess
or like the family.
What's that?
Or like as a function of the family.
Yeah, I suppose I would say that the family like transforms in the bourgeois revolutions, and so, but also so did like all these other relations of like kinship, eros, gender, sexuality. Which right today, like unfortunately, the left today like has collapsed all of these things into like the issue of identity. So like sexuality, for instance, is treated as an identity. Like you're born this way, you're born gay or something, or you're born whatever way. And so all of these questions kind of get collapsed and botched, whereas their non-identity with one another, like the separation of eros and kinship and family life, and their kind of reintegration along like kind of bourgeois emancipatory lines, actually provided a context for freedom. So like I'm trying to think of how to address this. So like
because I mean, I presume there are all kinds of different sexual feelings people had throughout history.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, certainly.
So I mean, so many people say that there were homosexuals in ancient Greece or something.
Mm-hmm.
Though, and there is something true about this, and something that's not framed probably. I understand how you're trying to frame it.
Yes, yeah. I mean, one example of like how it's different in bourgeois society versus in ancient Greece would be like, and I'm gonna like use another kind of moment in history, which is kind of like the medieval, like a medieval example. So like in like medieval society, in feudal society, kinship, romance, marriage, and like eros, all these things related in a totally different way. So like you had like a beloved in court, you would like fight for, but you would never have, if you were a knight, for instance, you would never like consummate your love for it. It would go. That was romance, right? But also you have like, and on the side you might go to like the guilds of like courtesanship to like partake in the pleasures of sexuality, which is detached from your family life, which is like your family has married you to this other family for like all these considerations about like aristocracy and land, and like who you're fighting for, who you're fighting against. And so then that's separate from like kinship dynamics. What happened with like the bourgeois revolution was there was kind of a relationship between that was formed between like romance, marriage, sexuality, eros, where people could, by mastering themselves along those lines, exchange themselves with others. And so the kind of emergence of that is really what's emancipatory and provides the context for people to choose like who they want to love, like that really basic thing, to choose like and to articulate their own desires and explore them. That's kind of like a pretext, having like free individuals in exchange with one another. Because before that, it would have just kind of been an aspect of life, kind of in a caste of divine chain of being. It would have been more static.
Yeah, so it seems this existed in a different way, maybe. Like, I mean, things existed in this relationship, this, I don't know, they were not really identities maybe, but
behaviors.
Yeah, so, and when you say gender or marriage, it seems to imply that gender didn't exist in the feudal times, and that's what I'm not sure.
Oh no, I mean,
because there were men and women.
Yeah, there were men and women, but you had more in common with people in your caste than you did with women. Like meaning like women didn't really like. So like if you were a woman in the aristocracy, you had more in common with men in the aristocracy than you did with women as like serfs. But of course, like Engels kind of famously talks about in family private property, the origins of family private property in the state, about how like the first class division was between men and women. And I mean that's only from the perspective of like the 19th century onward that's the case. Otherwise, it looks like you have civilization developing freely into society. Society becoming conscious of itself as civilization and overcoming itself as civilization. Only in the 19th century is it like we could do away with this whole necessary self-reproduction of social surplus. And from that standpoint, all of like hitherto history appears to be class struggle. But right, I would still emphasize like gender really transformed and became its own kind of abstract category in the bourgeois revolutions. Like the ability of women to consider themselves as part of the same lot as women is a phenomena of that emancipation.
I'm curious how you understand the grounds of opposition to this kind of bourgeois sexual freedom, especially as we get further into the 19th century and into the early 20th century, because you said a few things that touched on that. One was that there was a difference in the German principalities and states in their adoption of this Napoleonic bourgeois kind of sexual freedom, freedom of private life, legal system, the Saxons have been more conservative or something. So you can imagine, though, that over the course of the 19th century, the more backward or conservative states would just catch up, and the police nowhere would be policing private life, and this kind of bourgeois freedom would just expand and sort of take over. But that doesn't happen. And one of the distinctions that you mentioned that the police made when they were policing private sexual life, for example, was that they wanted to know whether men in women's clothing were prostitutes, or that prostitution is considered a greater nuisance. So I mean that to me kind of suggests that these issues around transgender or transvestitism were in some way like being collapsed into prostitution. But yeah, whether that's the case or it's something else, like how should we think about why there was a demand seemingly not only from the middle class statist progressives, but also perhaps also from the working class of this time for the police to do this? What were the grounds of that?
Yeah, and this brings up a point that I think was unfortunately kind of underemphasized, or I kind of didn't touch on it in the article or in my presentation, with respect to Stalinism. Like Stalinism rejected homosexuality as well, and I kind of in the article I'm focusing on my argument about like how Seresky's like use of the natural basis of gender was used to justify criminalizing homosexuality again. But really also what Ed's raising, it's an important point, and it goes back to what I said at the start of the presentation, which is like how we consider these things ought to be is actually conflicted, meaning like so like on the one hand like for people like for Stalinists even still up to today, like they might consider homosexuality to be a sign of the degradation of the working class under the conditions of capitalism. It's a sign of decadence. Decadence not a means of like self-indulgence, but a means of like crisis and decay. Prostitution similarly is considered as a sign of degradation and decay and decadence, both by the Second International and Stalinism. But on the other hand, the Second International also stood for decriminalizing prostitution. And these kinds of compromises, like there's like a whole kind of wealth of historians and like social movement activists who have become academics who have gone back to like this period and have like located like this is like where left have not moved beyond. Like we're still having these debates of like do we prioritize abortion, prostitution, marriage, equality, like documentation for trans people. Like what do we what do we prioritize? And it's kind of like it's useful when people can recognize that, because it has the virtue of being honest about just being merely interested in like policies of state management of superfluous populations and the unemployed. But I mean, as Judith Shapiro kind of said, like on one hand, like yeah, like let men like do the childbearing, like let like men transition so that they can take on some of the responsibilities that women have to do now. But on the other hand, like maybe no one should have to do those responsibilities. So like our like the conditions could be radically transformed, and our imagination of what's possible is actually kind of conflicted. I don't know if that answers your question.
Do you think there's a distinction between what you see in Stalinism and what you see earlier, like in the 1930s, early 20th century, is the kind of Stalinist trend, and you see something similar in the politics of the United States, where a lot of these, these state crackdowns on private life really intensified in the 30s. Is that basically just an exaggeration of the dynamics you see beforehand, like in these kind of urban industrial crises? The way that like prostitution or homosexuality becomes a kind of like recognized as a symptom of the social crisis of the working class. Is it basically just an intensification of that?
Well, I wonder because I think also like there's a sense of like there's a conservative like so there's like a socialist response of in like the late 19th century, early 20th century, recognizing like the degradation of sexuality and family life as a degradation of the working class in capitalism. But there's also a conservative response to that degradation, which is to try and restore it. And it's coming, even though they're addressing the same problem and they're both recognizing like a change that's taken place in industrialization, the conservative response is to like try and restore the previous order, which is, I guess, because like the Stalinist response was like, well, we're just gonna like reappropriate social surplus and hopefully that will just like resolve all the problems. But the conservative response was like, like we're gonna bring back we're gonna establish Prussian hegemony. We're going to have like martial value. We're going to like reinstill the family. And so there's kind of like a double think. Well, in both cases, it's a double think. And this is, Stalinism. I'm not apologizing for Stalinism by any means. It was a conservative turn. And it apologized for the kind of compromises of its time. It provided justifications for them. So it certainly also did that. But there's a double think, I guess, because on one hand, you're like reconstituting. You're trying to reconstitute old relations, but like society has moved on, and so you're ending up actually constituting new things. So it's peculiar because in the like mid 20th century, like for instance, you have like people kind of cracking down on prostitution. People like today, like there's a huge crackdown on sexual promiscuity, a huge crackdown on like child like pornography, child like sexuality. So like it's weird, and that goes back to like kids becoming workers, for instance, like. So like that would have been treated by socialists more symptomatically as like, oh, now kids are free too, like so like the whole family dynamics like thrown off with child labor in the 19th century. But right, so like like these kinds of concerns are coming out of like a weird, I don't know, like a weird 20th century moment where it's peculiar because like on the one hand people have all these kinds of like taboos, but on the other hand, it's like you have like the beaches and the like, I think in the 1950s you had like the first trans woman on like the front of like newspapers in the United States, and so you have this kind of like sexual liberation, and Bennett Streep to some extent actually provides this narrative from like a communist perspective, where he's like the Mattachines in the 1950s like supported all these issues. We just seen progress like up from then to like the Gay Liberation Front in the 60s to like the Combahee River Collective in the 70s. So like on one hand there's this seemingly increasing sexual liberalization of society, but on the other hand there's like this increasingly strict sexual taboos. It's like a peculiar kind of thing, and I think it indicates that like we still kind of exist in like the same circumstances of the 19th century, but under radically different. Like we don't have like a mass proletarian struggle for socialism, like viewing that as a symptom of the possibility for socialism. We just kind of have like vacillating, like young activists, I suppose, like with Me Too and stuff. Were there more questions on this side of the room before I go back? Gunnar, is your hand up, or?
No, I guess what kind of comes to my mind is like, I know like social planning isn't super hot with, probably because of Stalin's legacy, but how does a society sort of reconcile sexual liberation and like people not having a bunch of children that's correlated with that, like, because it's a good thing, but having children is also kind of a good thing. So
it's like on one hand having children's like freedom, like raising a family. Like people say raising a family and having a kid is like one of like the most amazing experiences of their life.
Right.
And that's not untrue.
Yeah.
And like women, like there are women who say like childbirth was the most amazing experience of their life. So there's something to that. But also like there's women who say like they never want to have a kid and that's terrifying, and there's something to that as well. So like yeah, and under the conditions of like I mean like in the Russian Revolution, like there was this kind of need to like resupply the labor force because of like the famines, the Civil War, the failure of the revolution. And so yeah, there's this kind of like horror scenario. That's like a horrific scenario where you have like the kind of criminalization of homosexuality, the criminalization of what would have been on the desiderata of sexual liberation before for socialism, in order to facilitate like labor supply, which like yeah, that shouldn't happen. On the other hand, like we might imagine about the future, like the ability to like reproduce people like at like industrially. Like I mentioned Brave New World as an example, as like a dystopia that's actually kind of a utopia, or even like The Handmaid's Tale is actually a utopian. Like so, there's like the new is it on Hulu or HBO or Amazon Prime? I don't remember which, but there's like a new version of The Handmaid's Tale that's like it has Peggy from Mad Men, and she plays the same character that she played in Mad Men. She's like a poor girl who gets like abused by the guys. But right, so like that's what like. But the original Handmaid's Tale was a bit more like I think a bit more ambivalent about what was going on, because some of the women in the Handmaid's Tale like who were in the cast of women who like bore the children actually loved it and enjoyed it, and then afterwards in like because like the novel has this kind of detached, cynical like sociological veneer. And so when it finished, like the last chapter of the novel is like kind of like the sociological sum up of the story, where they're like, it's not actually clear after this happened that things were better. And so it wasn't like to condone it by any means, but it was to say like, well, what was there to that? But which is just to say, and to loop it back to my presentation, like, right. So Judith Shapiro was like, right. On one hand, you could say, well, women are going to bear children because they're women and they're destined to that. You could also say, like, why can't men have children? You could also say, like, why can't we have clones or technology and flying machines, like, bearing our children for us? Right, like...
The last option is not something people think about anymore.
No, yeah, there's been a definite diminishing of people's horizons. And so even, like, posing, like, utopian imagination to people gets, like, a weird response. But yeah.
Well, I see clones as really the only way out. Well, that or so we see in Africa sort of like, we just designate a bunch of countries as like hyper socially conservative, and then they just create a shitload of babies, and then we just ship them across the earth to make up for like falling birth rates, which I think is kind of dystopian in itself.
A sexual gulag.
Yeah, almost. So I think those are really like the two options, and I don't know, I think cloning's a bit more humane almost.
Yeah, well, I think like all of the kind of like blueprints we could like come up with would actually be expressions of capitalism, and so like it's like not until like we're actually what's that?
Like an entrepreneur's idea.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So like it's like Fourier had these kinds of ideas with like the phalanstery, right? And then the Saint-Simonians in like the States and England and France actually implemented this, and that's how you got the Pullman factory. Honestly, that's like what happened. So it's like, yeah, as soon as like these ideas are like utopian and great and like they're imaginative, but when implied in practice, I mean, and even in thought, they're actually just expressions of capitalism.
Yeah. So at a certain point, would a socialist society almost be more like pro-family in the traditional sense, in that like just because it's not productive to have a family doesn't mean people can't do it? Does that make sense? Like you talked about now it's so cheap to make textiles, so cheap to have someone clean your house, eat in the cafeteria. I mean, those all kind of seem like capitalism making it less profitable to have a family. And so in that instance, would people being free to do whatever they want thus end up with more sort of traditional social organization in that sense? Do you think?
I mean, it's like a question. So one way that like a 19th century socialist Marxist would have put it, like Karl Kautsky, is that because he was dealing with stuff like this, like these kinds of questions all the time from people, like both like recruits and like political opponents who were accusing socialists of trying to destroy the family, or accusing socialists of like all kinds of stuff. So he would say in response to them, like, capitalism is destroying the family, like the disintegration of the family, and like is actually a product of like capitalism and industrialization, but it actually points beyond itself, and it will require like the constitution of new forms of family life that will transcend our current ones, that like we can't know ahead of time. So only like in working through these problems would they begin to kind of point beyond themselves in a practical sense.
Oh, I see.
Otherwise, like we just have this kind of like split image, screen image, contradictory imagination. That's just an expression of our present society, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Which is why like he was saying like, well, we need the party to like kind of accumulate and relate these kind of disparate struggles in order to actualize the possibility of like realizing them. But yeah, without that, it's like we just have science fiction, I guess, and we don't even have that.
Yeah. So when you were talking about like the article, the Shoop, right? The name,
their name, they go by they.
Oh,
they them,
right.
yeah.
So were they making an argument that like the CPUSA in the 60s or something, taking basically like a Stalinist like definition of the state as like, and then transplanting it onto like kind of this gay identity or like even like black identitarian politics was like a refutation of your characterization of it? Was he kind of like painting a positive portrait?
Yeah, exactly. So like it's weird because they were saying that I didn't deal with reformism at all, and like I didn't deal with the relationship of like the LGBT movement to the history of socialism, but I did, and I was saying like the advances that were made were actually self-contradictory, and I mean it posed this question of like the relationship between the movement, the party, and the state, and these advances were in crisis, and it required like a critical reflection and intervention that was missed. Like that opportunity was missed, and so now what we have is like these kind of frozen, disjecta membra of that moment. We have like these identitarian categories that are just kind of floating around. We have like these state bureaucracies that manage these discontents around gender, and we like don't know what to do with them in a sense. They're there, but like they're not like it's not inherently clear that how their history relates to like the next step as they might have done then. And so, right, on one hand, so like they're like in several steps. Like first of all, I'm saying there's like a contradictory dynamic in the initial socialist movement with respect to the relationship between reforms and the revolution. And then second, I'm saying like there's like a vast like abyss historically between that moment and our present moment. And we've inherited like frozen like pictures from that moment, but the relationship between them is gone. And so, yeah, Shoop in response to that, that argument was like, no, actually, it's not an abyss. We have this progressive history since the 50s, where like first Stalin had the black belt thesis, and then we've extended it to the issue of homosexuality, and then the Common Behavioral Collective got it right to say like it's about intersections of oppression, and so. Yeah, I think that's not an uncommon narrative among like people today.
It's good in that it reveals the lineage between from Stalinism to Maoism, because they are basically Stalinists.
Yeah. Can you say more about that, the lineage you're saying between Stalinism from Stalinism to Maoism?
Well, the most obvious link is the glorification of immediate working class identity in Russia and how this was applied to other identities.
And also like the national self-determination, because that's this Stalinist CPUSA's take in the 1930s, and right, and then the Gay Liberation Front, like that phrase Liberation Front is coming from the Maoist Liberation Front approach. But
it's missing Trotsky. I mean, like, the Trotskyism that we had on black nationalism on the syllabus is explicitly dealing with like the black belt thesis, the idea of nationhood for a racial minority in this case, but it can be sexual minority, just transplanted. I don't know too much specifically about Harry Hay, but like at least Shoop is honest enough to to recognize that it's a solenoid idea. I mean, it does kind of like the idea of the nation or oppressed minority. And that's, I think you brought up the idea of oppression versus freedom pretty well in your teaching as well.
Other questions? I can find Colin Fidias again.
So you mentioned this a return to essentialism, and I have two questions about that. First, it seems to kind of assume that essentialism is wrong, though the discourse right now seems to be a lot about what do medical experts say about this and that, and is this gender dysphoria? And I mean, I have friends that tell me that that they encourage people, now it tends to encourage people to transition as quickly as possible, and that to express, and that it's just natural and it's a true self, and to express it, and they worry that this fails to organize that in many cases it's not the way to go, and you shouldn't rush and all of that. And all of this discourse suggests to me, I mean, I'm hesitant to intervene because I haven't read a lot of research on these topics, I mean medical research. Is it necessary to read? Is it, to what extent we should get involved in this acquire scientific knowledge on gender and sexuality in order to address such issues? That's the first question.
Right. Well, I mean, I guess, when you say we, what do you mean?
The left.
The left. Well.
Or anyone interested in having an opinion.
Right.
Formed opinion.
Well, I mean, it depends on what you want to know and what you're trying to do. Like, if you're trying to provide people better, medical coverage, then yeah. Because, I mean, I was saying, and Judith Shapiro was suggesting, or I was suggesting, and Judith Shapiro actually said, what if men have children? That's not possible today. But it's something that people have, even Freud was well, we can do it with frogs, maybe we can do it with people. And the point being there, that's not off the table. So, if you're interested in, medical science as, an end in and of itself, as, I think most people who go into the natural sciences or any science, they just love what they're doing. So if that's what you want to do, jump into that. That's an interesting topic. There is funding for it. It is provided by the Democratic Party, but might as well make use of it. But what is I'm going to be a grad student soon at UIC, and so we're talking there was recently just the biggest bill, the biggest funding given to UIC from the Illinois legislation since 2001 recently, and that was totally done by the Democrats. But that means that I'm going to get a better stipend. But so I'm just saying, of course, as an intellectual, my interests are in line with the Democratic Party. I exist in the world. But yeah. So I would say to those people, pursue what you want to, the knowledge you want to pursue. But I'd also say with the caveat, this is what's recognized, where we are. I think even these categories become an obstacle to that research in a sense, and they end up kind of reaffirming the existing dynamics of the state. Meaning, I'm sure there's all kinds of excuses and reasons, preventing further research on certain areas because it's well, this is just what you do. And this is how we provide to these communities, and here's all this research about who's suffering in which neighborhoods, and where we're going to build a new center. That's what we have to prioritize now. This is how those decisions get made, and so I'm sure the politics will crop up in places for those people. But right, I wouldn't even know what direction to point them in if they wanted to raise that discontent, the level of politics. And I guess to get to then get to a different aspect of your question, which is talking about, because on one hand you're talking about professionals. On the other hand, you're talking about people who are trying to understand their personal psychology and how they navigate the system. And there, I would say it's not just with the transgender issue that we're dealing with a bunch of static frozen images of things that used to be moving in relationship to each other. However, in a contradictory way, everything's kind of like that. I mentioned the labor movement in Germany having been incorporated to the state. And those guilds that got incorporated into the state and became guilds, well, the unions that got incorporated and became kind of like guilds, maintained in the German state through fascism, and they're still there today. And like in the States, we have like the AFL-CIO merger and like the Bureau of Labor. Like we have our own kind of like frozen images of the labor movement from the 19th century. So yeah, like the collective like experience that we're participating in is like this reified social existence that's kind of frozen in time. And I think like people on an individual level, like their individual psychology is kind of prefers like regressed individual psychology in response to that. Because if you have an advanced individual psychology where you're like, I'm in control of like my self-mastery and I can like, you know, I'm like a free individual, and then you confront this really unfree static society, you're like, oh fuck that, and you're gonna crawl back in your hole or something. But right, I think like, yeah, I think basically what I'm saying is I think that, like for Freud, identification was like a moment, like a constitutive moment in psychological development, and so like you go from like primary narcissism to like identification, and then you like go through the Oedipal complex, or like the genital moment in sexual development, where you're like you're not just dealing with things in terms of identification, but you're dealing with things in terms of what you want to be and what you want to have, and you're like and although things might like you might develop like ego ideals that bump up against that like identification dynamic from like pre-Oedipal psychology, it's always being rendered into the service of like what do I want to be, what do I want to have, and so but in the absence of like again when you're faced with this kind of like cold static social reality, then you're likely to fall back onto these paranoid concerns of like am I who I want to be? Like am I really like what I want, like is that really what I want to have? And so like rather than putting sexuality in terms of like who do I want to be and like what do I want to have, it gets put in terms of like these paranoid kinds of responses of like, you know, was I born this way? Like am I fated to this? Am I doomed to this? And so like I think that's preferable for people. And so like I like to respond to that question about like, well, what do I think about how people themselves think about this? I don't know. Like, to me, it seems to be an expression of like a degraded individual psychology. But my like the response to that wouldn't be like, oh, like you all need to go get like psychoanalysis, and then you'll be better. But rather, it would be like we'd have to like overcome this static frozen world that's motivating you to like crawl back into these like previous stages of psychological development. But
when it comes to like who am I, what am I, in the humanities and anthropology, it's described as sexual dimorphism. Mm-hmm. It's like primary characteristics and secondary characteristics. What are you born with and what is evolved within you? Mm-hmm. Do you think that can fit into like radical constructivism, or do you think it can only fit into like middle ground?
Well, I guess like I think that I think that there is like a difference between gender and sex, and I think like who knows like what will happen with biology in like a free society, but like there's a relevance of these terms of like.
And I have another question. Mm-hmm. Biomedicine was developed under the construct and structure of capitalism of this society. Mm-hmm. So I'm in my class. I'm completely disregarding it, to be honest. Yes, I know biology. I understand that, but biomedicine, and also it seems like it was so politically driven to diagnose things that didn't need to be diagnosed. You
mean like the pathologization of what's actually exactly. Like a free decision? Yeah, I think that's like an expression of the problem. Like and I guess this kind of pings back to Fideas's question about like, well, what could people do about this? Or like, how would anyone who is interested orient themselves towards this? Like, if there was some kind of positive project to try and start a party, it would be unclear that this would be like the place to start, because it's so like it would be strategically counterintuitive completely, because you're looking at like very strong state resources backing like these communities that really do need these resources. And so, like, you're going to say, like, these people shouldn't get like what they need, like on one hand, and on the other hand, are you going to do battle against like the entire medical industrial industry? Like, or medical industry. No, like yeah, I don't know. I would say like that I don't think that there's kind of an easy solution. Meaning like I don't think it could get resolved at the level of thought. But yeah, it tasks us, and I think that the first step would be to recognize like the kinds of categories that we do have to understand it are like negative ones, or like we have to approach them negatively, if that makes sense. Did you have a question?
Yeah, I was just curious. I guess in your article and in general, how you respond to like the materialist feminist historical analysis of gender and sexuality as composing like bounded subgroups within the proletariat. Mm-hmm. Do you feel like this is an accurate sort of historical analysis, or if it's more accurate to say like the proletarianization of marginal identities is you can only overcome that through a general proletarian uprising?
Well, I mean, so I would like point at the term proletariat, and I'd like call attention to it, and say like for Marx that was a critical negative category. Like the task of the proletariat was to overcome itself and to abolish itself. So in the same way, like, and it was supposed to lead the democratic revolution in the struggle like for socialism. And so like in like capitalism, Marx defined as like the crisis of bourgeois society in the Industrial Revolution. And so all of the bourgeois social relations were in crisis. And in a way, you could say that you could like pick out any of them, any of the particular ones, any of these particular discontents, and see how they point beyond themselves to socialism. And that the task of the proletariat would be to do that, to like lead these discontents beyond themselves to socialism. So yeah, I would complicate the kind of framework and say like it's not like class versus oppression. It's not like you need to have like organization based on class versus organization based on oppression, but rather like class itself was a critical category, and it was treated as like a phenomena of the crisis of bourgeois society and capitalism. The fact that society divided itself into two great classes was a symptom of the problem, and right. So that's it wasn't affirmed. It was a critical category. And I think so feminism and like on the other hand like Stalinism, like Stalinist material like economic analysis, which is like has a class analysis, quote unquote, and what they're talking about is an amalgamation of an interest group in labor. They're not really talking about like class consciousness in the sense of masses of people kind of preparing for like the abolition of class. That's not what they're talking about at all. So like I guess it's a false dichotomy, and I would really position both of them are an expression of the disintegration of this kind of critical consciousness of the possibility that capitalism poses for socialism. But yeah, I don't know if I responded to your question.
I mean I think mostly. I think I was also kind of curious if you see that like the real problem of trans liberation or of queer liberation, or the liberation of women is operates in the same way that the liberation of the proletariat does, or that because they are proletarian, so to speak, in their, as Engels says, like their relation to the social needs of reproduction. If their liberation occurs also by overcoming themselves and abolishing themselves as what they are, like abolishing myself as a gay man, because the categories of gay and straight no longer matter in terms of this sort of economic relation.
Yes, yeah, that's what I'm suggesting. Yeah. I'm suggesting like that these categories, like, these psychic categories that were developed in response to political obstacles, and now exist in response to like political administration in the state. That if the state was totally transformed and like withering away, and like class society was anticipating its self-abolition, like all of these categories would be up for you would need this is the moment where critical reflection would be absolutely needed in order to understand how each of these particular categories are potentially overcoming themselves in socialism. So yeah, precisely. What's that?
They would wither away, right? Like
they would. I mean, they'd be withering away, but they'd also be tasking us to overcome them.
Right.
So you'd have these. You would. I mean, because I'm. That's why I was kind of saying it's unfortunate in my article I didn't really give enough attention to this issue of Stalinism, and its kind of honest rejection of queerness as being a symptom of the degradation of the proletariat under capitalism. that's like a real moment in the crisis of gender. And obviously, I'm not, again, condoning it, but I'm saying, like, these kinds of tensions that are within the concepts themselves are actually, like, what will need to be critically reflected on and overcome.
Right. Like, how does the dictatorship of the proletariat deal with, like remaining forms of consciousness from capitalist society?
Right.
Can I, like, comment on, so, like, one way to approach it is also that itself, that, like, critical reflection would be contradictory, in the sense that socialists recognized, let's say, the oppression of women within the family, and then sought to sort of rid the category of women as being oppressed as such. But there was also practical considerations in the sense that, for example, in Germany at the time, like, men and women couldn't meet in large groups. And so the organization of women's socialist groups was actually a response to practical political considerations that simultaneously, of course, seems to establish the group of women as being, like, substantive. But of course, its aim was to undermine that substantiation itself and to just sort of, like, universalize the category of women as a bourgeois subject. But of course, you need to, like, do both, and it's the party through political considerations which hopefully will be able to deal with contradictory phenomena.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and it's funny because now today, like, the left wants, like, we have an integrated society of men and women.
Yeah.
And the left, like, wants to, like, administer these separate spheres. I mean, maybe there is still practical relevance for that. I don't know. I'm a man. I don't know.
I did have one contemporary issue. Like, it's funny that, like, gay used to be somewhat of a, like, a in itself sort of revolutionary word or something, and now, since you're right that there's sort of a gay population that is conservative and has sort of been over to Trumpism, like, queer seems to have taken the place of that. And I don't know, I don't want to just, like, ask about, like, post-neoliberal politics per se, but, like, it sort of gets into, like, nuts and bolts present stuff, but it's like, do you see, what does it mean to say that, like, the trans movement has passed provocatively, right? In the sense that, like, is it because of actually, like, sort of gay politics under Trump, or when did it pass?
Well, so I want to, like, address this by way of, again, addressing Joe Biden again. So Joe Biden, like, a couple months ago had this great thing, like, this great quip where he was like, first there was, like, racial, like, emancipation in the 60s, then it was for the women, then the gays, and now the trans.
Okay.
And so, like, there's this, like, progressive narrative of the Democratic Party ideology, which, like, again, like, even, like, a radical Marxist like Bennett Shoup is, like, totally on board with, totally justifies. There's this progressive narrative, like, now is the trans movement, and it's the culmination of, like, these struggles since the 50s and 60s, like, of the civil rights movement, et cetera, the new left. And so, right, like, there, on the other hand, trans people, there's, like, Trannies for Trump Twitter or something, and there's, like, there's Gays for Trump Facebook group. And it's weird because these groups end up having the same arguments that the existing left has. So, like, the existing left has, like, it's like, oh, well, are trans people, like, really, should they really be included in the liberation struggle? Like, this is the radical feminist take. The gay group for Trump has the same arguments. The trans people in the gay Trump group, like, have this argument with the more conservative lesbians in that group. So it's like they haven't left the left. And so it's weird because this is now becoming, like, the ground, like, the way I put it in the article was, like, Trump's dragged, like, the Reagan coalition into, like, a period beyond the neoliberal management of discontent by diversity. So, like, because if you watch The Apprentice, like, Trump's all about the diversity stuff. He loves playing those kinds of dynamics. He's like, oh yeah, the girls beat the boys, girls are better than boys, like, and he's like, and like when George Takei was on, he's like, he does great things for, like, the gay community, like, what a great guy, like, helping out people, like, so, like, he's, Trump is as much a product of the 60s as any other politician that we have. And so, yeah, when I'm saying, like, he's kind of dragged this, like, 80s coalition into the present, he's also in doing that, changing the ground for politics, like, the center ground for politics. And so, yeah, the center is changing. It's not clear how, but, like...
But you have to break in order to reconstitute it.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. And this was an opportunity, I'd say, missed by the left. I think, like, the left just tailed the Democrats. And this is like, the major problem I would have with Shoup again. And, because, like, one of the things that they were saying in their article was, like, oh yes, like, everyone's united in their oppression and struggling together for, like, better progress, and there's this narrative we can draw from the 50s. But, and in doing so, they, like, were part of the broader socialist movement, which meant, like, this united fight against the right. And so it really does just justify, like, whatever compromises need to be made ahead of time. But I'm sorry, I don't know if I addressed your question. Was I addressed it? Okay, cool. Fideas, you've had your hand up again for a while.
Yeah. So to return to essentialism, what do you think is the link between this? I mean, was it always a dominant discourse, or is it? I mean, at least on the left, it seems to be like now, without them realizing it, we have a very essentialist discourse. I mean, we saw that with Rachel Dolezal has a lot of issues. I mean, the race discourse is like extremely right wing, but you can say that, but it's very. I mean, it is focused on like ancestry and all of that. But even in the issues of gender sexuality, there is nominally a support of social constructionism, whatever that means, but it doesn't really. It's not really. It's just. It's self-contradictory between social constructionism and I would think how is that linked with like the collapse of the left politically and the more limited horizons? I mean, it seems like it could still be like good liberals supporting the freedom for everyone to choose and all of that without resorting to essentialism. And maybe to add to all of this is also the issue of, I mean, we have this article here on millennial sex panic, you say. So yeah, there is also, I mean, they talk so much about oppression, but then there is this tendency to police your own group and the relationship between groups. And I see, like, I mean, I would say that instead of like liberation, sexual liberation, we are just trying to establish new norms, new rules and categories of how to behave among people.
It's like a very neoliberal phenomenon. Like Foucault talks about this, like kind of like advocating for like kind of unintegrated communities of interests, like kind of like developing their own aesthetics and their own styles and tastes in isolation, but then like struggling for representation in like the state, but at the same time like maintaining their independence to police themselves. I feel like this is like on one hand I think it's like very neoliberal. On the other hand, it's like it's a product of like it's something that you like already saw in Fordism, which is like pluralism, like democratic pluralism, the idea like, and what Adolf Reed calls racial democracy, like where you have like. In the Democratic Party, you have like the machine politics of like originally in the 1930s it was based on like ethnic constituencies, and then plus labor, and then each community like polices itself. So like a contemporary example of the same phenomenon is someone like Carlos Ramirez Rosa, in Chicago. Are you familiar with him? He's a DSA guy. He was elected a couple of years ago to city council. He's an alderman. What ward is he in? I forget what ward he's in, but he's an alderman. And he opposed the No Cop. He opposed the Cop Academy. He's part of No Cop Academy, which is like what Black Lives Matter's become post-Trump. But the city council wants to bring in like a Cop Academy to Garfield Park because responding to the concerns that Black Lives Matter came up with, Black Lives Matter in Chicago led to the Department of Justice intervening in Chicago's police department and making all these recommendations, which included increasing the training and professionalization of the Chicago police force, which includes like developing a police academy. And so Rom was like, we're gonna follow up on that, like Black Lives Matter, like we hear you, making it happen. And of course Black Lives Matter is like, no, you have to spend the money on schools, this is terrible, and so Carlos Ramirez Rosa is on board with that. But in doing so, he got rejected from the Latino caucus and city council. So this is an example of the self-policing of these communities at the representational level. So basically what someone like Adolf Reed would say is the old ethnic constituencies of Catholics and Protestants and the Irish and the Italians in city government that existed before was just replaced with new constituents: women, students, gays, yeah, you know, blacks, like, this would be the new basis of politics.
Actually less recognized.
And less recognized.
In the sense of the subconscious essentialism, right? It's not really.
Yeah, and that's like, and so the flip side of that is like the discontents that you know, that people have with their integration into society. So like they might like aestheticize it. You have like different kinds of like communities, like, you know, DIY and stuff in each of these groups that then like has their own aesthetic. And but like, so on the one hand you have like this kind of like infantile rejection of being integrated that then like just reaffirms the integration nevertheless. And then you have like these like incorporated statified representatives. But yeah, I don't know, like the way I reference this in terms of like in this article was like there's a screen image of like representational politics on one side and movementism on the other, with respect to issues of gender and sexuality. But yeah, I guess we're like 3 after. Do we? I don't know when you guys want to.
I mean, we have the room technically, as long as the discussion is going on front end. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Do we have any other questions? If you need to go, obviously.
Yeah, no, I'm easy. I didn't know like what if like someone's gonna come in here and like ask us to. If there's like a security guard waiting for us.
No. I think the cleaners have already swept through. So.
Okay, cool. But yeah, other questions?
Is there an after party?
Good.
You might not know anything about this, but my teacher, well, I read this in a text. Have you read about gender ascription in self-identification? Okay, could you please explain your stance on how this definition could have come about and actually exist?
Which definition?
I have the definition that it's the assumption that evaluations of criminal offenders are related to the ascription of stereotypic gender-linked traits.
I missed the part with criminals. Wait, how is that?
It's a little bit strange. That's why I was asking. The assumption that evaluations of criminal offenders are they related to the ascription of stereotypic gender-linked traits.
Oh.
Is this that like men get sentenced to heavier?
Yeah,
right.
pretty much, kind of.
Assumed sort of violence. Or...
Yeah.
Right.
I think so.
So I guess I suppose I don't know as much about this, but it seems to relate to like issues with the prison industrial complex, like people being like given higher sentences because of superficial circumstances such as like their race or gender. In which case I'd say like you know, I don't know. I don't know anything about how this relates to gender, but like what I do know is I have a sense of how it relates to race. So for instance, like there is like, first of all, there's like an astronomical like the U.S. and like prison rate is like astronomically high, and then I also know that the rate of like black prisoners is disproportionately larger than others. I also know that people like Adolf Reed will complicate that by saying if you have a geographical analysis, though, it actually plays out where in states and counties that have like more white people, that's not the case. And so what he's pointing to there is that there's actually like an issue, like it's related to employment, and something that's shown in like sociological research, and that like one might know theoretically who's acquainted with Marxism is that crime and unemployment are positively related to one another. And so, right, like, I mean, what I would say is then the issue becomes about like, in that context with the question of race, like some people think that the reason why that this rise happened was because of racial politics, meaning like anti-black racism. In which case I would say like, on one hand, like that might make sense because of disproportionate black population in prisons. On the other hand, oftentimes the people who were enforcing and introducing those drug laws that increased sentences and kind of opened up like these new ways of incorporating unemployed black men into the prison industrial complex were actually black politicians coming out of the insurgent black politics movement of the 1960s. So like New York's a good example of that. New Orleans is a good example of that. And so, I mean, that's like how I would respond. So it's like a cause-effect kind of thing, meaning like for people who think that racism caused it, they're thinking the effect, like they're taking the effect to be the cause. So there's like a reversal there. Whereas like the actual cause is this political problem that isn't reduced. Again, I don't think it's reducible to like just unemployment. Like it is unemployment, and that's like kind of a quick answer. But there's also this political problem of like the political management of unemployment. And so like like with respect to like like the emancipation of labor in America, like going back to slavery, like I don't think like Jim Crow is the reason why the rates increased, because they astronomically increased since like the late 60s to 90s at a greater rate than ever before in history. And so it's not just like the legacy of Jim Crow or something else happened. And it's not explainable in terms of racism, because oftentimes it was the black communities themselves under like the Black Power ideology that were like, we need to bring black power to our communities, like black power in politics, that actually brought this about. So I don't know if that example like bears any weight on how people might view that with sex and gender, with like men being given higher sentences. But I would just kind of flag this broader example of like race as like a precedent for how I might address it, that question at all, if that makes sense. And I would be wary that maybe people might do a similar kind of cause-effect reversal with the question of gender that they do with race, if that makes sense.
I think specifically to do with like sexual crimes, and you kind of talked about this a bit in the sex panic one, is how, I love that phrase, how men are kind of seen as what would you say, the sort of perpetrators, and women are victims. And like, you said, anybody whose experiences with sexual assault don't conform to this get kind of pushed to the margins. And I think you can kind of see that in like male and female teachers raping children, with the power dynamics, etc. I think you'll find women usually get like shorter sentences, and I think that's because, a male teacher having sex with a female pupil versus a female teacher with a male pupil, since our society kind of sees men as instigators. Like, I don't know, you ever seen that stupid South Park thing? It's like, a male student goes and says like, hey, my teacher had sex with me, my female teacher, and everybody just goes, nice. Yeah. So,
yeah.
I would say, I think that was kind of a good point in this. It kind of ties into the question.
Mm-hmm. There's that SNL skit with, what is his name, Pete? Who's the young guy?
No, Pete.
He dated Ariana Grande.
Yeah.
Huh?
Yeah. Pete Davidson.
Pete Davidson, yeah. Pete Davidson plays like a 15-year-old who's been sexually abused by his teacher, and so like he's like on trial, and the opposing attorney's like trying to like grill him about like like what did she do to you? And he's like, yeah, she took me like in her car like and bought me a bunch of food and clothes, and we went back to her place and we banged and like blah blah blah, and the judge is like, yeah. But right, yeah, like this is like in the cultural ether.
Yeah.
Is it considered rape if you're like a 15-year-old and you automatically?
Yeah, it'd be statutory rape. Yeah. It would be, yeah. I guess this is a whole other topic, but I did write about it. And yeah, like something else, that like this is like a Spartacus League point. It's also true. But like sexual offense is like kind of another way that like the prison industrial complex like makes ends meet, meaning like they can get more out of they can make it more worthwhile by cracking down on more sexual offenders, and also like bringing people back for like repeat offenses and stuff. So it's like actually like it's not just like the shocking headlines of like Michael Jackson and R. Kelly, although that's also like that, like those things are reflexes of what's happening as well. But yeah, sexual offense is used as like a way of like keeping the prisons full in a sense. Although that's changing, I guess, now with like Trump's like prison reform, which I'll say provocatively, but.